All right, I'd like to welcome you all to this panel presentation as part of this year's virtual Louisiana Historical Association conference. My name is Michael Shane Powers. I'm an assistant professor of history at Angelo State University, and I have the privilege to chair and comment for this delightful panel, The Politics of Acquisition, Commerce, Employment, and Theft. The papers will be presented chronologically, which means a slight change of order as listed in the program. We will have Kyle Jackson first, then Tom Aiello, and then Natasha Mcpherson third. I'll introduce the presenters individually before each paper. Likewise, following all three papers, I'll give a few short comments and will then open things up for a Q&A. The audience, you can post questions or comments in the chat function, so make sure to explore that feature. So our very first paper presentation is from Kyle Jackson. Kyle Jackson is a transnational historian of the Americas and a doctoral candidate at UC Berkeley. His research looks at early US Latin American relations through the prism of New Orleans. The project he will be presenting explores how boosters and businessmen in the antebellum South's leading port attempted to capitalize on the US-Mexico War and leverage the United States' economic and military influence in the region. He will be reading his paper entitled Demands of Commerce, the Louisiana Tehuantepec Company and the Complexity of Southern Economic Diplomacy. Mr. Jackson.
All right, thanks a lot. As you will see here, my title has shifted a little bit. This is my first time presenting this work, so I would be sincerely grateful for any and all feedback. You can see here a stock certificate for the Louisiana Tehuantepec Company, the short-lived and ill-fated experiment that I will be talking about today. Okay, so in the immediate aftermath of the US-Mexico War and the resulting 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the geopolitical situation in the Western Hemisphere remained very much in flux. The United States' opportunistic invasion of Mexico had definitively settled the Texas question, and the acquisition of California and its deepwater harbors promised a future of US power in the Pacific. That promise, along with the discovery of gold in California, magnified the stakes of constructing a quick and viable route that could take passengers, mail, and cargo to and from the West Coast. Occurring as it did in a moment of feverish railroad development and expanding networks of steamship lines, the treaty stimulated enormous interest among developers and speculators eager to cash in on new commercial possibilities. Now, as railroad men in the Northeast and the West began to plot transcontinental paths across the newly claimed territories, a different set of schemers also pushed increasingly ambitious projects to establish interoceanic communication across a point on the Central American Isthmus. While there were a number of diplomatic, technological, and economic hurdles that confronted each of the proposed routes, the exigencies of the moment amplified the entreaties of a small but growing chorus of advocates for a railroad, and perhaps eventually a canal, to be constructed across the narrowest strip of Mexico, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. At the forefront of these lobbyists was a dedicated group of commercial-minded men in New Orleans who organized themselves in 1849 into a committee that would eventually, after incorporation in 1857, be called the Louisiana Tehuantepec Company. Over the next 2 decades and beyond, many of the city and state's leading lights went to incredible lengths to secure the construction and transit rights, the diplomatic sanction, and the capital required to carry out the project. Their stated objective was to ensure that the benefits of the route would accrue to their own city and enable it to reach its presumed destiny as the import and export capital of the South and the West, if not the entire world. However, despite their best efforts to leverage the military might and international clout of the burgeoning American empire on their own behalf, New Orleans' considerable exertions were stymied and stalled time and again. The primary impediments to realizing their vision were, first, the complex internal politics in Mexico and the understandable fear of further Northern American aggrandizement. Second, New Orleans' commercial rivalries with more powerful interests at home and abroad. And third, the capricious nature of a diplomatic approach reliant on personal relationships and a shared perception of mutual interest. This paper argues that there are lessons to be learned from this aborted moment of transnational cooperation in an era long associated with manifest destiny. First and foremost, it reveals the sense of entitlement that North Americans brought into dealings with their Southern neighbors, an attitude that consistently sabotaged effective negotiation. Despite the platitudes about friendship and harmony that North American diplomats and journalists trotted out in defense of yet another demand for Mexican territory, such appeals to reciprocity were drowned out by haughty declarations of North American glory and threats to re-invade and compel recognition of the Louisiana Company's claims by force of arms. Needless to say, this public posturing, as well as continued filibustering expeditions conducted by US citizens across the region, made it difficult to sell a scheme like the Tehuantepec Railway as, quote, a fair exchange between wise and considerate parties, enriching both and adding vastly to the mutual security and good understanding, end quote, as the Washington correspondent of the New Orleans Picayune claimed. The Mexican Congress and the press vociferously objected to North Americans continuing to treat them as a defeated nation after the peace treaty. Understandably, they saw the issue as an existential threat to the country's sovereignty and autonomy. Now, this resistance elicited a certain degree of restraint on the part of the US federal government, particularly given the need for cooperation to secure the border and fight powerful indigenous polities in Texas and northern Mexico. The feds ultimately towed the line, even while private citizens and corporations clamored for a more interventionist approach. Second, exploring the Tehuantepec scheme through the lens of New Orleans reveals a concrete vision of US hegemony in the Gulf that appealed directly to Southern sectional interests without explicit reference to slavery. Promoters of the project instead attempted to tap into the expansionist zeitgeist and the prevailing Anglophobia of the period. Seeking to outmaneuver their British rivals in Central America, Southern businessmen with an intimate interest in and understanding of Mexican affairs saw the expansion of their commercial relations into Latin America as a fair reward for their considerable contributions to the recent war effort. They also understood it as a critical chance to undercut the growing monopolistic dominance of New York in the commercial realm. Boosters promised that Tehuantepec would rejuvenate the flagging economy of New Orleans, reduce the South's reliance on British and Northeastern capital and shipping, and redirect a large share of the heartland's agricultural products and allegedly the free and untrammeled commerce of the whole world into the entrepot at the mouth of the Mississippi. So, departing from much of the literature on antebellum Southern nationalism, I argue that the multifaceted plots to transform the Gulf of Mexico into an American sea by the annexation of Cuba and Tehuantepec represented more than a desperate dream of extending a slaveholding empire south of the Rio Grande. Now, although the Tehuantepec idea had been floated for some time and buoyed by favorable coverage in New Orleans newspapers, by 1849, most of the energy in the country and even the rest of the South was coalescing around other transit routes to the Pacific. These routes, as you can see on the map on your screen, threatened to exacerbate Louisiana's isolation from the flow of trade. Rail networks connecting the upper Midwest and the East Coast already had produced a dramatic decline in the Mississippi River traffic. Proposed rail lines and canals across Panama or Nicaragua would do little to benefit Southern commerce. The general feeling in the city was that New Orleans had to offer a different way forward if they hoped to survive and capitalize on the steam-powered transformation of long-distance trade. The first challenge was to convince the famously conservative business community in New Orleans that the Tehuantepec Railway was a worthwhile gambit. In order to garner support for the initiative, the scheme's architects had to persuade potential subscribers of the technological and economic feasibility of such an ambitious overseas infrastructure project. Deploying maps and timetables that were reprinted and excerpted repeatedly in newspapers, advocates demonstrated how, compared to the usual circuitous route around Cape Horn, a railroad across the isthmus would result in, quote, the saving of 1,700 miles in distance and consequently in time, which is capital. Appealing to the shibboleth of Southern self-sufficiency, they underscored how establishing a controlling interest in Gulf shipping would provide commercial autonomy and strategic protection from the whims of foreign powers and northern rivals. As a way of diffusing anticipated criticisms from anti-expansionists, they stressed the legality of the contracts, the indirect endorsement of the Mexican government, and the supposedly universal advantages that opening the transitway would provide. All of these arguments resonated with a public infatuated with industrial modernization and Anglo-Saxon imperial expansion. From the outset, New Orleans boosters had good reason to believe their endeavor would have the full support of the federal government. For starters, President Polk and his emissary Nicholas Trist had lobbied hard for the purchase for $15 million of the Tehuantepec rights in the original draft of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This provision was rejected by the Mexican authorities on the grounds that the rights had already been granted to a Mexican citizen, Don Jose de Garay, in 1842. In the intervening years, Garay sold his concession to a firm operated by Philadelphia speculator Peter Hargis. Hargis then negotiated with the Louisiana contingent for a partnership. Now, while the legitimacy of these various claims and contracts remained in dispute for years, the fact was that the US State Department was clearly eager to see Tehuantepec fall into American hands. This, combined with the force of law that theoretically protected the extension and transfer of such concessions, meant that the New Orleans company was not crazy to assume that they could count on federal protection of their rights abroad. Here you see a map that was partly commissioned by Don Jose de Garay, and notice the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in the bottom left inset. Now, in Mexico too, the stakes were high. The dream of trans-Isthmian communication was as old as Spain's New World Empire. But since the advent of Mexican independence in 1821, Tehuantepec had become something of a national symbol of stunted progress and untapped potential. The tumultuous first decades of the Mexican Republic had made such an ambitious undertaking more of a pipe dream than an actual plan of action. Garay's proposal was explicitly designed to bolster Mexican national integration. In the 1840s, the country was struggling to control both its northern and southern borders and dealing with the independence movements of indigenous nations and renegade states like Yucatan. A large railroad and steamship project with the potential to attract foreign trade and capital was appealing to ascendant liberals in Mexico who clamored for investments in modernization and economic development. However, the political situation in Mexico fluctuated dramatically over the first 10 years of the life of the grant. Several different regimes took and lost control. Santa Anna fell in and out of favor multiple times, and the United States' invasion fundamentally shifted the balance of power on the continent. By 1852, when the Louisiana Tehuantepec Company began to ramp up its efforts to break ground on the isthmus, the legitimacy of the Garay grant had been thrown into question, as had the wisdom of allowing an eager band of Norteamericanos to purchase, develop, and colonize a 135-mile strip of land bifurcating their country. The Mexican press excoriated former President Manuel Gomez Pedraza and other official envoys for even entertaining a proposal that they believed would open up Pandora's box. They lamented the agreement that Pedraza had tentatively reached, which they recognized could, quote, serve as a pretext for the advances of our neighbors and avail to their bad faith, end quote. Calling the New Orleans filibusters a stain on the 19th century, Mexico City organ El Universal sneered that North Americans, quote, will always be a people of wars without cause, a people of pirates, a people among whom foreigners cannot be safe, end quote. Journalists and politicians had begrudgingly accepted the forced terms of the treaty that ended the war, but there was surely no reason to encourage further expropriations. In regards to their northern neighbor, La Crónica wrote, quote, let us not aggravate our situation by feeding the United States' thirst for wealth, their ambition for land, their spirit of domination and conquest. Ratifying the Tehuantepec Treaty and allowing a North American company to develop the land will be nothing less than inviting the wolf in. Still, the new president, Mariano Arista, wrote to US President Millard Fillmore to reassure him that Mexico was not conceptually opposed to the project. What he did object to was, quote, the pretensions advanced by the agents of the New Orleans Company, who appear to be determined that the opening of the communication shall take place in no other way except under the privilege granted to Don Jose Garay, end quote. The company's stance had been wholeheartedly taken up by the United States' official negotiator, Robert Perkins Letcher, who insisted on the legitimacy of the grant, even as the political winds began to blow against him in the Mexican Congress. Arista had encouraged Letcher to persuade the Louisiana Tehuantepec Company to apply directly to the Mexican government for a new grant, but the New Orleans men rejected the overtures. The inflexibility and entitlement of the company were taken as a direct insult to Mexican national honor and independence. Letcher's ultimatum seemed to deny a basic right and signaled to Arista that the scheme might be more nefarious than all the talk of amicable partnership indicated. Referring to the incomprehensible stubbornness of the New Orleans company, Arista lamented that, quote, the conclusion is irresistible that the object particularly aimed at was an occasion to bring the two countries into conflict, and that with this intention, Mexico was required to do what it was known she could not and would not perform. In daring the Mexican government to accept or reject an all or nothing deal, Arista continued, quote, the true interests of the company are sacrificed for a shadow, end quote. The matter would go no further under the circumstances. Now, unsurprisingly, to those of you familiar with the mid-19th century, the imperious attitudes of American journalists, businessmen, and diplomats was bound up with characteristically bigoted caricatures of the Mexican race and an abiding faith in Anglo-Saxon superiority. Referring to the opposition encountered in the Mexican Congress, a correspondent of the Daily Delta stationed on the Isthmus wrote back to New Orleans that, quote, the great ones of the nation, stricken with fear of Saxon progress and democratic aggression, have girded up their loins and whetted up armor of defense against the anticipated swallowing up of Mexican misrule by the onward march of North American innovation. And here you see sort of a map, a cartographic vision of Manifest Destiny. You've got the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Battle of New Orleans, a portrait of William Walker, and maps of Central America. So even if the empty threats of newspaper men were not enough to disquiet the Mexican government, the clear and present danger of North American strategic maneuvers did add a certain urgency to the negotiations. In the United States of the early 1850s, not only journalists, but also legislators began to speak of the annexation of the Spanish colony of Cuba as an inevitability, and one that would add further impetus to the Isthmian Railway project. As early as 1849, the New Orleans Crescent outlined the political advantage of the Tehuantepec route, arguing that it was part of a larger vision to transform the Gulf of Mexico into, quote, an inland sea of the continent, free from European influence. And this project was not merely hypothetical. Multiple filibustering expeditions aimed at the island were organized and launched out of New Orleans in the early 1850s, most notoriously the disastrous attempted invasions of Narciso Lopez. Although the Cuban annexation question was far more directly connected to the volatile politics of slavery than the Tehuantepec scheme, the two issues were perceived as interrelated, at least from a geopolitical point of view. In the United States, the military benefits of building a passage across Tehuantepec were seen as key to mobilizing national support. The recent war with Mexico had involved multiple blockades and naval movements along the coast, which underscored the importance of mounting and maintaining a larger presence in the Gulf. At the same time, diplomatic tensions with England, France, and Spain seemed to continually threaten the growing US interests in the Caribbean and Central America. As the surveyor of the Tehuantepec route, J.J. Williams, argued in 1851, an ideally located transit point and a stronger naval presence in the region would, quote, enable America to distance England forever in the worldwide race for dominion of the seas, end quote. In the mid-19th century, this was quite a lofty prediction, to say the least. Much to the chagrin of New Orleans, however, their best laid plans were soundly rejected by the Mexican legislature in April of 1852. This decision produced outrage and vitriol in the North American press. The New York Times snarled that failing to adopt the treaty as proposed was an insolvent act of robbery. Insisting that the federal government back the Louisiana Company's property rights abroad, the Times did not mince words with its warning to Mexico. Quote, with a people so irrational and ill-informed, and a government as changeful and unsubstantial as a phantom, a decided tone of dictation supported by an adequate display of force is the proper and indeed only mode of dealing. Mr. Polk's valuation of the Tehuantepec route was not in the least exaggerated. 15 millions, if not enough to buy, may be enough to pay for the forcible occupation of the tract, end quote. Even more audaciously, a Picayune correspondent threatened that, quote, if we shall be forced to seize upon the isthmus, she, meaning Mexico, will have to pay the expense of the enterprise. This was an extraordinary claim of imperial power that would be revived in a different context by a bellicose American presidential candidate more than a century and a half later. So, to wrap up the story, apart from a few moments of optimism due to favorable regime changes, the Tehuantepec project continued to sputter and remained a potent emblem of both hope and failure in Mexico and New Orleans for the rest of the 19th century. By the 1880s, what remained of the Louisiana investors and their descendants were still dragging their claims through courts, hoping for some way to salvage their losses. It wasn't until 1907, when the Panama Canal was already nearing completion, which of course rendered a trans-Isthmian railroad far less valuable, that Porfirio Diaz's administration finally completed the work first sketched by Don José de Garay 65 years earlier. By then, national railway development and the relationships with foreign capitalists that facilitated it had grown into an explosive political issue that contributed greatly to Diaz's overthrow in the Mexican Revolution. So what had begun in the mid-19th century as a promising effort to secure the commercial destiny of New Orleans and Mexico ended up instead mirroring the precarious trajectory of inter-American cooperation in the Gulf more broadly. Imperialism disguised as altruism, military strategy paired with economic development, regional interests in tension with national ambitions, many of the patterns and tendencies of US-Latin American relations in the 20th century can be traced back to those first years after the invasion of Mexico. In that sense, the Tehuantepec scheme is far from an insignificant and fantastical footnote in the history of American foreign relations. Instead, it offers a fascinating case study in how imperial power and industrial capitalism tangled together and played out in the diplomatic arena prior to the establishment of US hegemony in the hemisphere. Thank you so much for your time, and feel free to reach out with any questions, and I look forward to the rest of the presentations.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jackson. Appreciate it. All right, next up is Thomas Aiello. Thomas Aiello is a professor of history and African American studies at Valdosta State University and is in the process of creating an anthrozoology program at his school. He's the author of almost 20 books and dozens of peer-reviewed journal articles. His work helped amend the Louisiana Constitution to make non-unanimous juries illegal and was cited in the United States Supreme Court as part of its decision ruling them unconstitutional. His work was also part of the effort that led Major League Baseball to include Negro League statistics in its historical records. He is also a doctoral candidate in anthrozoology at the University of Exeter and a member of the board of the Animals and Society Institute. He will be reading his paper titled Hen Men and Red-Handed Murderers, Louisiana's 1879 Larceny Provision, Freedmen, and Non-Human Animals. Thank you.
Thanks so much. In the postbellum period, hold on one second, let me get out of full screen so I can actually do the, okay, we can do it this way. All right, in the postbellum period, hierarchical twin bigotries, white human over black human and human over non-human, combined in the form of a series of pig laws in the states of the former Confederacy, where white governments expanded charges of grand larceny to include the theft of farmed animals like pigs and chickens. Taking advantage of the hunger and desperation of freed people and the tradition of theft among slaves to generate convictions that led to disenfranchisement and the elimination of black political power. Louisiana would be no exception. The emphasis on vigilance against thieves of animal bodies was a larger stakes game than those in power acknowledged or even realized, as in the explanation of Carrie Wolf, thinkers from Freud to Sartre to Foucault have used sight the human signpost of that vigilance as a mark of delineation between humans and non-humans, and of human transcendence or supremacy. As humans emerge from a more rudimentary state while de-emphasizing olfactory and auditory and tactile senses in favor of the visual. In the words of Woolf, the figure of vision is indeed ineluctably tied to the specifically human. But more pragmatic reasons for conditioning such vigilance also existed, as pigs were expensive. In 1860, Southern livestock had a valuation of $500 million, more than twice the worth of cotton. The South raised 2/3 of the country's hogs that year and traded more hogs than all other large animals combined by at least a factor of 5. In the postbellum period, however, that production had suffered. As Jonathan Bass has explained, 8 states of the former Confederacy produced 2.6 million fewer hogs in 1880 than they had in 1860. Pigs arrived in the New World as part of the broader Columbian exchange. Christopher Columbus brought 8 pigs to Cuba on his second trip west. The Spanish explorers who followed did much the same on other West Indian islands, all in aid of creating an easily accessible food source. Hernando de Soto brought 13 pigs with him to Florida in 1539 and had 700 at the time of his death in 1542. Pigs could take care of themselves, and there was plenty for them to eat. They bred quickly, and they were easy to kill. The English became involved in 1607, bringing 3 pigs to Jamestown. In 18 months, the colonists counted more than 60. By the late 17th century, Robert Beverley reported that pigs swarm like vermin upon the earth. They were plentiful and roamed freely. That ability of some pigs to roam free led to the creation of a feral hog population, commonly called razorbacks, in the colonies. The grazing of pigs in the wild caused little problem, but when free-roaming pigs rooted cultivated farmland, humans reacted violently. Massachusetts in 1633 legalized killing pigs that encroached on colonists' farmland. The emphasis was always upon protecting English property and sentiments, never on the well-being of the pigs themselves. With the profusion of pigs in the New World, colonies, and after the Revolution, states began to monetize an available resource by trading pork throughout the hemisphere. As Brett Mizell has argued, the more pigs there are in the world, the harder it has become to see them. Such was true in the colonies and early states, and if pigs were now an official commodity, new laws had to help create figurative and literal boundaries around the new business. Fencing laws appeared in most states to require pigs to be kept within enclosures. The lower classes protested, leading to early 19th century hog wars where poor farmers defended the open range against fencing. Again, the lower classes lost. Fencing laws and private property rights becoming the standard of the day. The Southern relationship with animals was always fraught. In 1785, South Carolina prohibited farmers from letting hogs run free in 2 low-country counties. White farmers responded by burning down the fences that were being erected. While such burnings ultimately benefited livestock in the short term, such moves were never about non-human animals themselves, who were always destined to be killed. Instead, hogs were the narrative tools by which freeholders fought against what they saw as unfair and overburdening government intervention. That unwillingness to see the personhood of non-human animals remained constant across time, but also across boundaries of race. In slavery, theft of a hog would earn a beating or equivalent corporal punishment. In the postbellum South, such theft could mean years of incarcerated labor. "The Negroes are so destitute that they will keep stealing," said one Mississippi white woman. "They think, the last one of them, that they have a right to what belongs to their former owners." Such was a continuation of antebellum thinking. In one instance, white officers of a local church investigated a slave for theft on his owner's plantation, and the slave told them that he didn't consider such stealing a sin, as he was the one who produced the goods of the farm and thus had a right to them. The horrified officials discovered that such was the common way of thinking among slaves. Frederick Douglass told a similar story of hunger and slavery, and of discussing his hunger with a friend named Sandy Jiggins. "You must learn to steal something to eat. You mustn't be hungry. I could steal a pig, blessed be God, and shout hallelujah." "How do you justify that, Sandy?" Douglass asked. "Well, you see that pig? That pig is master's property. Your master's property too. Suppose you put some of that master's property into this. It would only, in the language of General Jackson, be a question of removal." The story was telling, as it acknowledged a fundamental equivalency between slave and sow. Both were master's property. At the same time, there was another threshold of equivalency that pigs did not meet, in the same way that the native population was acknowledged as human by Jackson, but obviously didn't merit worthiness of life. Sandy Jiggins would never have suggested to Douglass that he kill another slave and exclaim hallelujah. Livestock, then, met the property equivalency, but did not merit worthiness of life. It is a demonstration that equality was not a single thing. There was instead a tiered understanding of equality by those in power, a constructed chain of being, of white slave owners over slaves, of Jackson's troops over Indians, and of all of them, including Jiggins and Douglass, over livestock. Meanwhile, selling poultry was a way for slaves to supplement their own subsistence for many in both colonial and national slavery, despite the fact that such entries into the economy were tightly regulated by white owners. Slaves practiced a variety of husbandry techniques to produce chickens, but such did not end the public accusations of chicken theft. By the 1800s, Black men and women had fully come to be associated with chicken stealing. They were often convicted even when the evidence against them was light or preposterous. At the end of Reconstruction, white redeemers sought to play on the hunger and desperation of freedmen to create state pig laws that moved livestock theft of hogs or chickens from petty larceny to grand larceny on the statute books, attempting to feed a burgeoning convict lease system that provided a version of the slave labor that whites had lost following the Civil War. The most infamous pig law came from Mississippi in 1876 and stood at the intersection of white supremacy and speciesism, maintaining the property status of non-human animals and attempting to return Black humans to the status of property in the immediate post-Reconstruction age. The law reduced the grand larceny property value from $25 to $10 and singled out a variety of stolen farm animals as requiring a charge of grand larceny, even if the human-imposed value of those animals was less than $10. Any animal with the value of $1 or more earned the human thief a charge of grand larceny, which merited a sentence in the state penitentiary. In 1947, Vernon Lane Wharton described Mississippi's pig law, arguing that it exploded the prison population and fed convict lease. His characterization held sway until the 1990s, when Matthew Mancini's study of convict lease demonstrated that Wharton's claims did not match actual convict statistics, and credited the increased number of arrests and conviction after the law's passage to convict lease itself. But whatever the direct cause of increased criminal convictions, passage of Mississippi's pig law was not only intended to punish African Americans and to tie Republican rule to a scourge of lawlessness, but it was also passed to help earn the loyalty of small white landholders because their economic position was so tenuous and their reliance on the few livestock in their possession kept them alive. Along with the direct need in the face of poverty, there was also secondary theft, known as deadfall markets, wherein poor whites convinced freedmen to take a variety of goods or small animals from wealthier farmers in exchange for a small pittance or illicit material like whiskey. Still, whether the theft was primary or secondary, it made the Black population vulnerable to white machinations and revised larceny laws. It also, of course, meant that animals stolen were not part of a direct action against hunger, but instead part of a retail effort to provide some kind of ancillary profit to the human thief. Another reason for these livestock larceny laws was to tie disfranchisement to felony convictions so as to eliminate the Black right to vote. Those laws were part of a broader effort to move misdemeanor crimes to felonies in a variety of areas that principally affected Black Southerners. The expansion of criminal penalties for livestock theft was only part of a coordinated regional agenda that used disfranchisement for criminal conviction to aid the Democratic Party, and it created a vicious circle. An 1880 editorial decrying convict leasing in the Weekly Louisianian, not Louisianan, the Weekly Louisianian, which was Louisiana's largest Black newspaper at the time, argued that hen men are consigned to the penitentiary for a term of years at hard labor for the theft of a chicken, side by side with a red-handed murderer. They will leave their gloomy cells only with a sense of degradation which will render them hardened villains and irreclaimable to the demands of good citizenship. In an 1880 hearing about Black migration north after Reconstruction, Charles Otey, a Black lawyer and newspaper editor, told a Senate committee that disenfranchisement for petty larceny was a principal grievance. The law was made for the purpose of disfranchising colored men, he said. If a colored man steals a chicken, he is pretty liable to be sent to the penitentiary. That trip to the penitentiary then took away his right to vote. There was no mention made in the hearing about the lives of the stolen chickens. There was a vigorous Republican response from Black and white leaders attempting to fight against the practice, but none were able to stop the onslaught of these petty larceny disfranchisement laws. Animals, however, were always objects of the debate, never the subjects, valued only with a monetary designation on both sides because of their ability to provide for humans or because of their ability to land free people in prison. Livestock theft, and more particularly chicken theft, became a key focus for individuals on both sides of the debate over the suffrage rights of individuals convicted of petty theft. Another New Orleans Black newspaper, the Weekly Pelican, quoted white New York commentary that decried the fact that petty offenses in the South, like stealing pigs and chickens, are punished with extraordinary severity, and it has been declared that the profit derived by the state from the chain gangs has had the effect, unconsciously perhaps, to encourage sentences for long terms. There was nothing unconscious about it, but the commentary made it clear that motives for pig laws were evident to contemporary observers around the country. The pig laws themselves began in 1875. Prior to that year in Alabama, horses had been the only property animal whose theft fell under the category of felony grand larceny. That year, however, the state legislature changed the laws to include any cow, hog, sheep, or goat to the list of property animals considered grand larceny if stolen. Arkansas's legislature made a similar move that year, reducing the grand larceny charge to stealing anything, including farm animals, over $2 in human value. Like so many others, it was known as the Arkansas Pig Law because of the implications relating to livestock theft. In 1875, Georgia's legislature passed its own infamous pig law, a statute that raised the penalty from a misdemeanor to a felony for hog theft, putting it on the same legal plane as cattle theft. 2 years later, the state's prison population had more than tripled, and 95% of that new population was Black. Then it was Virginia, then North Carolina. South Carolina would follow in 1878. The following year, Louisiana created a new constitution in 1879 that added larceny to the list of offenses that led to disfranchisement. There was no direct mention of the theft of farmed animals in the larceny article, but such theft would clearly fall under its scope. The conclusion we can draw is the only one that jives with the assumption that the law was specifically designed for the purpose of making arrest of former slaves easier at the expense of farmed animals. We can draw that conclusion from, one, the context provided by the pig laws in other southern states being adopted at the same time, and two, the proven interest that Louisiana had already demonstrated in using the power of the law to get as many former slaves as possible into the criminal justice system. The year following the 1879 Constitution, the state would pass its first non-unanimous criminal jury law, starting a process that would feed a centralized convict lease system using Angola as its hub. And Louisiana wasn't alone in using a vague strategy in the construction of its pig law. Florida used a similar strategy in 1880. Thus it was that southern states like Louisiana took turns criminalizing the theft of hogs, combining a white supremacy that had been generative of speciesism among slaves with its own version of speciesism that used the lives of non-human animals as weapons against the now free Black population in its midst. Mel Chen describes a linguistic animacy hierarchy in which language orders various forms of human life above that of non-human animal life, then that above plant life, and that above non-living entities. The 19th century South was a model of Chen's animacies, with white power brokers creating levels of value within humans. Man was more valuable than woman, rich more valuable than poor, a plantation more valuable than a farm, landowners more valuable than sharecroppers, former slave owner more valuable than a former slave, free citizen more value than a convict, white more valuable than Black, and human animal more valuable than non-human animal. It was the Great South cultural chain of being. The legal definitions of non-human animals originally demonstrated a clear animacy hierarchy between various non-humans as well. But the pig laws were meant to level that particular playing field. Chickens, for example, were far more plentiful and far less expensive in human dollars than, say, cows, but by making chicken theft a felony, not only were white legislators further devaluing the lives of desperate Black tenant farmers who took chickens as a method of survival, but they simultaneously altered that linguistic hierarchy by eliminating the legal difference between different farmed animals. Linguistics, of course, is never static, and those hierarchies still existed in other contexts. Cows remained more expensive than chickens, for example. Cows required more maintenance. The corpse of a cow provided more meat than the corpse of a chicken. But in a legalistic society, legal equality meant more. Black sharecroppers understood such a framework. For example, when their burgeoning pseudo-equality during Reconstruction disappeared after the Compromise of 1877, further allowing abuses of the criminal system. Thus, the status of chickens in the animacy hierarchy rose as that of African Americans fell. But both movements on that particular linguistic ladder led paradoxically to a further devaluing of both lives, ensuring that chickens would be seen as nothing more than actual property and freedmen would be seen as nothing more than potential property. White assumptions about Black criminality colored the way they thought about the law. Though plenty of white Southerners were also destitute and hungry, and though they responded by stealing as well, livestock theft was assumed to be a race issue over and against one of class. Almost no one save Negroes went to trial, explains historian David Oshinsky. As convictions mounted, Southern prisons turned Black. Once that feat had been accomplished, the state pig laws became unnecessary. Mississippi's pig law would come under fire from poor white farmers in the 1880s and would ultimately fall in 1888. The others would disappear in the years to follow. None would survive into the 20th century. Though Louisiana's history with both convict lease and non-unanimous criminal jury verdicts demonstrates that the legacy of the motivating factors for the laws would continue through the entirety of the 20th century. But while they existed, these laws demonstrated the close relationship between two forms of objectification, of generating an other for the ends of power formation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our third and final paper is from Natasha L. Mcpherson. Professor Natasha Mcpherson is an assistant professor of African American history at the University of California, Riverside. Professor Mcpherson received her MA and PhD in history from Emory University. Her research examines the interior and private lives of African American women living in the aftermath of slavery and Reconstruction. She is completing her book manuscript, Women and the Making of Creole New Orleans, which is currently under review with UNC Press. She is currently part of an interdisciplinary health disparities project funded through the NIH, where she surveys the effects of fear on African Americans and explores the efficacy of current mental health care practices to serve African American mental health needs. She'll be reading her paper titled Creole Women's Occupational Strategies and the Politics of Wage Earning After Reconstruction.
Okay, we're having a little technical difficulty. She should be on just a second.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction. Until her death, Creole matron Stella de Mazalier never reported an occupation to the census takers. For 30 years, she appeared in the census as a wife, mother, and homemaker, while her husband Eugene, a tailor, appeared as sole breadwinner for the family. Tragically, in 1899, Stella's husband Eugene took his own life, leaving Stella and the children to support themselves. Eugene's death undoubtedly devastated the family, but his death may not have been as economically disruptive for the household as it might first appear. 8 months after Eugene's death, when the census taker came to the household, every member of the de Mazalier household reported an occupation, including Stella. In the 1900 census, Stella de Mazalier reported herself as a commercial seamstress. Now, this isn't Stella, this picture I have here, but this is her sister. This is as close as I could get. But this down here is just an image of her where she appears in the census. That's the 1900 census. Excuse me. In the 1900 census, Stella de Mazalier reported herself as a commercial seamstress, and her daughter Louise worked as a dressmaker. Although the women had never before reported occupations in the census or city directories, their ability to obtain employment as professional seamstresses is evidence that the women had been sewing for years before Eugene's death, despite reporting no occupation to the census taker. During the years Stella and Louise would have been honing their craft, Eugene de Mazalier, a renowned tailor, worked for some of the largest fashion houses in New Orleans. Their sewing skills, together with his employment as a tailor, suggest at least the possibility that the women performed professional seamstress work, even during the years Stella and Louise listed no occupation. By itself, Stella's decision to omit her wage-earning labor in the census was not especially remarkable. Women with no occupation listed sometimes earned wages from home, albeit informally or infrequently. However, when we consider Creole women's wage-earning labor and their manipulations of the public record against the backdrop of post-emancipation reorganization of racial and legal boundaries in Louisiana, we can begin to consider the ways Creole women's wage-earning strategies and their handling of the public record functioned as part of a larger social and political reorganization of Black New Orleans and the Black South. After the Civil War, Louisiana moved to eradicate its tripartite racial system and replaced it with a biracial one. All persons of African descent were forced to share the same degraded legal status, but as the state moved to eliminate legal differences among persons of color, the Creoles increasingly emphasized the social and cultural markers that identified them as distinct from non-Creole Blacks. For Creole women in particular, their wage-earning labor had the potential to associate them, their partners, and their families with the drudgery and debasement of Black women's work, or to bind them to more respectable forms of women's work. Therefore, Creole women and their families were highly conscious of the way that they performed and recorded women's work. This paper considers the ways that Creole women's wage-earning occupational strategies were employed, manipulated, omitted, and erased in an attempt to preserve Creole social distinction at the moment Louisiana lawmakers were forcing Creole and non-Creole Blacks to share the same racial and legal space as second-class citizens. Arguably the most striking feature about all Black women's work in the census after Reconstruction was the omission of women's occupations. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Black women increasingly embraced their domestic roles and placed less emphasis on their roles as wage earners. In 1880, nearly 75% of Creole women and over half of non-Creole Black women in the 7th Ward reported no occupation. Considering that just 15 years earlier, the majority of Black women performed forced labor, the omission of women's labor in the census is striking. By 1900, the percentage of Creole and non-Creole women who reported no occupation was about equal, with nearly 2/3 of all Black women reporting no occupation. Black and Creole men did everything they could to keep their wives, daughters, and sisters at home, and the high percentage of women reporting no occupation is, to some extent, a reflection of the men's successful efforts. But with the growing emphasis on domesticity as part of proscribed ideals of Black femininity, we can assume that at least some women simply refused to name their wage-earning labor in the census. In 1900, widowed mother and homeowner Octavie Lamotte reported her occupation as landlady. 10 years later, neither Octavie nor her adult daughters listed any occupation in the census. But property tax records indicate that around the time of the 1910 census, the Lamotte women owned at least 3 other residential properties on Elysian Fields Avenue, suggesting the women still earned occupation from their residential properties, despite listing no occupation. In some ways, the women's refusal to report their occupations as laborers corresponded to the ways they saw themselves. In the years after Reconstruction, Creole and non-Creole Black women defined themselves primarily by their interior and private lives and not by their wage-earning labor practices. Increasing efforts by the state to curtail Black political freedom and social progress in the late 19th and early 20th centuries prompted Black folks to resist the conditions of their labor and place greater emphasis on the home and the security of their private lives. Black women celebrated their roles as mothers, intimate partner, and kin, and earned wages when they had to. As one Black domestic stated, "When I say my job, I mean a job that you did," indicating a rupture or separation between the way the woman regarded herself and her performance of wage-earning labor. Some women may have also omitted wage-earning activities that did not necessarily correspond to a formal occupation. Women sold eggs from the chicken coops in their yard, sold candy and treats from their front window, made extra meals for their husbands to sell to their coworkers, took in laundry when necessary, ran errands for neighbors, ran lottery numbers and other wage-earning activities. Because women were involved in a number of wage-earning activities, formal and informal, legal and illegal, they resisted labeling their work as occupational, rather considered their wage-earning activities a private matter. Although white lawmakers and city leaders primarily regarded Black women as laborers, Creole and non-Creole Black women defined themselves primarily by their contributions to their families, households, communities, and not by their wage-earning labor. Refusal to name an occupation or perform wage-earning labor from home were small but significant ways that women resisted being defined by their labor. To understand the conditions under which Creole women negotiated their work, it is necessary to consider the shift to a Creole cultural identity from a class identity once rooted in free colored status. In the years and decades after emancipation, Louisiana replaced its antebellum 3-tiered legal system with a biracial one. The elimination of the intermediate free colored class brought New Orleans in line with the rest of the South, but it was a major source of contention in the social reorganization of New Orleans's free and freed Black communities. The legal distinctions of the formerly free colored class the legal distinction was gradually replaced by social distinctions of the Black Creoles or Creoles of color. But the qualifications that distinguish Creoles from non-Creole Blacks were also in flux with the reorganization of the South. The migration of rural Black folks and formerly free people of color to the cities forced New Orleans Creoles to contend with country Creoles, Black Cajuns, light-skinned American Blacks, and a host of other newcomers to the city. The Creoles of color, seeking to distinguish themselves from others with whom they shared the same racial status during Jim Crow, distinguished themselves in part by preserving the socioeconomic and cultural connotations that once associated them with free colored status. Features that once distinguished the economic lives of elite free women of color, including economic security, homemaking, skilled forms of labor, and performing safer, less vulnerable work, became increasingly associated with Creole ethnic identity. As sociologist Virginia Dominguez noted in her foundational book, White by Definition, quote, socioeconomic associations in turn became indices of Creole identity, end quote. Therefore, women's labor and wage earning provided more than mere economic support for the household. The type of work women performed helped to mark their inclusion in and other women's exclusion from the Creole community. The Creoles' effort to maintain associations with the formerly free colored class were loosely rooted in ancestral ties with early Creole families, but a Creole ethnic identity was increasingly bound up with displaying visible markers of intra-racial class privilege. Creole women avoided public associations with Black labor in part by earning wages from the privacy of their homes. By 1880 and 1930, no more than 38% of Creole women ever listed an occupation in the census. However, the evidence from the census contrasts with other sources that show Creole women as active wage laborers. The Woods Directory for Black businesses feature a number of Creole tradeswomen offering their services often from home. Women who were reluctant to report their personal business to the census takers were sometimes to report their personal business to the census takers were sometimes willing to advertise their skills and services in an effort to expand their clientele. In 1912, 21-year-old Creole hairdresser Rita Barois worked from her parents' home on St. Philip Street in Treme, where she offered hairdressing services as well as massage and scalp treatment. Creole matron Victoria Gaspard worked as a fashionable dressmaker from the Frenchman Street home she shared with her husband, elderly mother, and nephew. Oral narratives by Creole women living in the early 20th century also reveal a number of wage earning activities outside the jobs listed in the census. I will list a few of them here. They sold goods from the market, made groceries for white families, washed brick walkways with ochre and colored powders, and a number of other jobs. For Creole women, performing wage earning activities was different than having an occupation, and that understanding impacted the way they reported their labor to the census taker. Despite omitting women's labor in the census, Creole women and girls constantly were finding new ways to earn wages, often by performing labor from the privacy of their homes. As socioeconomic privilege began to rival ancestry as a primary marker of Creole status, economically established persons of non-Creole ancestry could sometimes become Creole. So social and economically stable light-skinned Blacks and mixed-race Blacks, Black passing Catholics of diverse ancestry, and rural Blacks who spoke French sometimes integrated into the Creole community in New Orleans. In the case of Stella de Mazalier, she did not descend from native-born French or Spanish descendants, which was alleged to be central to one's qualifications as Creole. Stella was born to a French-born father and an enslaved Black mother, yet her light skin, French language, and Catholic faith, as well as her respectable labor as a homemaker and seamstress, made her a candidate for inclusion in the Creole community. Sometimes light skin accompanied by wealth or social privilege was enough to bring one into proximity with the Creole community. Women who sought to mark themselves as Creole consciously shaped their labor and wage earning methods to conform to ideal standards of Creole womanhood. Not surprisingly, between 1880 and 1900, most Creole women reported themselves performing traditional forms of labor previously worked by Creole women of color, free women of color. Sewing was the most commonly reported wage earning activity for free women of color and remained popular among Creoles into the 20th century. I'm gonna skip down a little bit. Seamstress work also represented the most significant continuity between Creole women's work and the labor of their free colored ancestors. The census revealed occupational ties between generations of women. In 1880, 7th Ward widow Félicité Estève and her 2 daughters listed their occupations as seamstress. Félicité, who was born in 1836, had lived most of her life as a free woman of color, but her youngest daughter, Carolina, was born during the war, would have only known seamstress work after emancipation. Carolina never had a personal association between seamstress work and free status, but she knew that women like her with formerly free colored mothers often plied the same craft as their free colored elders. Living in the same residential building as Félicité was Josephine Toussaint and her 3 daughters, all of whom reported their occupation as seamstress. The 7 seamstresses in the New Orleans street house ranged in age from 19 to 55 years old. The Estève and Toussaint daughters honed their craft with their formerly free colored mothers, ensuring that seamstress work continued to be associated with the formerly free colored class and their Creole descendants. Seamstresses may have experienced higher social status, but the labor did not necessarily correspond to a higher economic status. Seamstresses' wages may have been generally higher than domestic workers, but the pay was not enough to live comfortably. As at the turn of the century, urban Black women who worked as domestic laborers earned between $2 and $14 a month, while seamstresses in the Black Belt earned between $4 and $16 a month. The wages were moderately higher than for domestic women, but wages for seamstresses weren't markedly higher. High-end dressmakers and specialty seamstresses earned higher than average wages, but those women were in the minority. Because life for Creole women was demanding and unpredictable, women's labor in wage earning often required a collaborative effort among household members. A handful of Creole women had hired domestic help, but the majority of Creole working women had to juggle the demands of wage earning labor and domestic chores themselves, often with the help of other residents. Wage earning women who went to work all day were often still responsible for cleaning their own homes, caring for children, and cooking family meals. By enlisting the help of other women in the household, wage earners could ensure the home and children were cared for while they earned money to support the household. Large, extended and augmented Creole family households relied on the collective effort of parents, children, extended kin, boarders, and live-in domestics. Women's collaborative efforts became even more critical to maintaining distinctions in Creole women's work around the turn of the century, when the last vestiges of Creole legal privilege began to fall away. In the 1894 article, The FMCs of Louisiana, P.F. de Gournay recognized that blending the formerly free people of color and the free slaves into one shared category, declaring, quote, the FMCs lost their individuality. The article states that, quote, the same peculiarities of language, creed, manners, and customs which combined to make the Louisiana Creole different from other Americans distinguish them from other colored people of the United States. But the article ultimately rang the death knell for the Creoles. Quote, the FMCs are a lost race whose history is not written, end quote. Creole women's efforts to mark their labor and wage earning strategies as distinct from Black women's work was part of their larger effort to hold on to Creole distinctions in response to the efforts by the state to eliminate legal distinctions among persons of African descent. I'm gonna just drop down and talk about how these seamstresses are losing status. Essentially I'm just skipping through, but seamstress work goes out of the hands of individuals and local shops and they move into factories. As seamstress work became less closely associated with higher status, the census indicates that some women abandoned the trades altogether. By the early decades of the 20th century, a small but significant number of educated middle-class Creole women joined the professional ranks. In 1910, 3.5% of Creole women reported professional occupations, but by 1930, approximately 13% of Creole women reported professional occupations, compared with nearly 3% of non-Creole Black women. This pales in comparison to the almost 62% of white working women in professional jobs, but it's a position that Creole women took a lot of pride in. Okay, so I have one more slide that I want to show you. As racial and color classifications shaped experiences of freedom and citizenship during Jim Crow, women sometimes relied on their light skin and physical appearance as necessary social capital to obtain better jobs. Well-connected women could rely on social kinship ties for access to less vulnerable work, but women with fewer social connections to money or property, Creole, sometimes use their light skin as social capital. The turn of the 20th century, some employees solicited light-skinned Black employees exclusively. One advertisement in the newspaper solicited the employment of a bright mulatto or quadroon girl, boasting of clerical or semi-professional work available to only women with fair skin. While these jobs weren't limited to Creoles exclusively, Creole women were eligible for more elite jobs that preferred light-skinned employees. One woman said, after applying for a job, she said, you see a job in the paper saying that they needed a light-skinned girl. I shouldn't have even gone in there because the ad was in the paper for light skin. Whether the women obtained jobs through hard work, family connections, or simply by having light skin, a significantly higher percentage of Creole women obtained professional and semi-professional occupations than did Black women. The small but significant number of Creole women in professional and clerical jobs once again reinforced differences between Creole and non-Creole Black women's work and highlighted the importance of light skin as a marker of socioeconomic inclusion. This is the last part. In the years and decades after emancipation, the politics of Creole women's work shifted in response to the social and racial developments of the emerging Jim Crow order. As Creole identity became increasingly bound to matters of class privilege, Creole women employed traditional methods of labor and developed new strategies of wage earning that marked them as Creole. Their individual and collective efforts to embrace the emerging socioeconomic qualifications for Creole membership can be read as a general refusal by women to accept the erasure of privileged status after Reconstruction. When read critically, these census records act as hidden transcripts of how Creole women manipulated women's work and the reporting of women's work to conform to shifting standards for inclusion in the Creole community. The census then becomes an important document for the telling of Creole women's history, not necessarily for the richness of detail contained within or the accuracy in accounting for Creole women's occupations, but as part of Creole vernacular history. The reporting of women's labor in the census demonstrates how Creole women saw themselves and their wage earning labor in relation to the state's effort to reduce all Black persons to the same degraded racial status as second-class citizens.
All right, thank you very much. Well, 3 wonderful papers. Really thrilled to be able to just offer a few brief comments on each one of these in order. And of course, I'm sure these are all part of larger work, so you might address these at other parts of your work that you just weren't able to get to today. But first up, we had a paper from Kyle Jackson, who really explored some New Orleans boosters and how they formed a company to advance the railroad and maybe even a canal across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Mexico by partnering with or maybe appropriating an original grant to the Mexican entrepreneur in what Jackson accurately identified as, quote, imperialism disguised as altruism. So he also argues that these New Orleans-led schemes to dominate the Gulf and Circum-Caribbean cannot be reduced to extending a slaveholding empire. I really liked how Jackson showed the question in his research from both the US and the Mexican side. That's key to being transnational history and not just comparative history. Likewise, a good job in this paper of demonstrating that transnational issues really can't be examined in a vacuum. In this instance, that attempts at a Tehuantepec railroad were really interconnected with schemes to annex Cuba. So I had a few questions that I'll pose to Mr. Jackson. Likewise, just remind everyone to go ahead and throw any questions or comments you may have into our chat window. We'll explore those as well. So some possible additions or questions maybe to flesh out going forward. At some point in your work, do you explore the thoughts or writings of Gray himself, the individual who had received the grants there? So does he have any letters or other records? Can you get at his voice or thoughts would be my question. Likewise, where does this fit in regards with party competition? Is this Democratic or Whig policy, or is it common ground? Also, just briefly, for the sake of time, we'll go through the comments of all the papers and then we'll allow each to respond after that. So was this Democratic or Whig policy, common ground? Likewise, do government sources like consular records in places in Mexico, do those have some some records that you can find? And maybe if you wanted to dabble in some theory of the metropole and the periphery. Is New Orleans in the metropole or periphery? That's up for debate, depends on what perspective, of course. Another interesting thing that occurred to me is Benito Juarez is in exile in New Orleans from 1853 to 1855. Did he have any thoughts on that? Lastly, I felt that filibusters are really the elephant in the room. So coming to grips with, is this Tehuantepec company merely a different means to the same filibustering ends? Are they talking out of both sides of their mouth where they're telling people who support filibusters, hey, we're doing the same thing? Or are they genuinely trying to be different? So some questions to consider. Then moving on to Thomas Aiello. Myself as a University of Arkansas PhD, and I see Michael Martin is in attendance, another Arkansas PhD. We'll refrain from doing a woo pig suey for you. that we could all do. But Dr. Aiello's paper really looked at the so-called pig laws, which deem theft of farm animals grand larceny as an intentional means to undermine Black economic, civil, and political rights while boosting the convict lease system. And I really was intrigued and enjoyed the tie-in to how expanding criminal penalties, basically shifting petty larceny to mean grand larceny, really presaged formal disfranchisement efforts like the Mississippi Plan or poll taxes and things like that. Since, of course, as you accurately pointed out, stealing hogs then meant convicted criminals could not vote. So I think this has a big part in historiography that really emphasizes, of course, that you've got Jim Crow coming about well before more hardline de jure things like Louisiana's 1898 Constitution. Also found it interesting the tying between both pigs and Black Americans in the late 19th century, as you mentioned, quote, meriting not the full worthiness of life. Some possible additions that kind of struck me was if you wanted to dive in or anything about foodways and pigs. Of course, foodways is so much of a burgeoning historical field. Likewise, court records. Do we see evidence in court cases of Black defendants trying to push back in any way? And are these pig laws at all connected or alluded to in the early environmental or conservationist movement, I was wondering? And very much was intrigued by that phrase of the Great South Cultural Chain of Being. I'd be interested to learn more about that. Likewise, Aiello focuses on the economic and political justifications for speciesism, but I'm curious about religious and scientific justifications that were very common at the time as well. Then finally, exploring, I'd be curious about why these pig laws were removed a decade or so ago. I was intrigued by, as you said, that animal theft was assumed to be a race issue, not a class issue. So do we see a shift there? Wondering if poor white Louisianians are successfully trying to bring about that change. All right. Last comments would be for Mcpherson's paper. Dr. Mcpherson had a really fascinating paper on the politics of Creole women's work and how they really shifted in response to the social and racial developments of the emerging Jim Crow order. The Creole women really astutely employed traditional methods of labor, but developed new strategies of wage earning that marked them as Creole, particularly in the sense of postbellum notions of respectable middle-class femininity meant that Black Creole women defined themselves, or tried to, primarily by their interior and private lives, and not by their labor and wage earning practices. And I was intrigued by the shift to culture as a primary Creole identity and away from the earlier Creole identity, as you mentioned, rooted in class status as free people of color. Likewise, I'm really fascinated was how you showed this reciprocal nature, that the qualification that distinguished Creoles from non-Creole Black Louisianians was also in flux in this reorganization of the South. So the migration of rural Black folks and formerly free people of color forced many New Orleans Creoles to contend with, as you described, country Creoles, Black Cajuns, light-skinned people of color, and the like. Also thought this was a great example of how granular history, looking at individuals at the ward level, but still including generational commonalities and a good bit of change over time. Also astutely interrogating kind of different sources that we see maybe an omission in the census, but looking and seeing those same people in some of the directories I thought was quite intriguing. So some questions I had, possible additions for Dr. Mcpherson. Are Creole women of color or their work present at things like the New Orleans World's Fair in 1884 and 1885? There's a lot there for interpretation about the extent that Black New Orleans and Black Louisianians are embracing the fair or resisting it. But I'd be curious to see, as you so adroitly use sources, even if there's omission, like if they're not in the census record, using occupations. If Creole women aren't participating in the fair or not shown as much, what does that say? But likewise, if Creole women of color are at the fair, I think that could be an interesting thing to explore. Likewise, with your look at change over time, and of course, an emphasis on respectability, are Creole women, even poorer Creole women of color, are they very much opposed to participating in things like Storyville or prostitution? To what extent are Creole women of color in that red light district or not? Just to be curious about that. But really enjoyed reading these papers. This has been a wonderful panel. So if each of you would like to respond to those or not, we can open up time for that. But again, also, perhaps after you respond, I'll be happy to look at our chat bar and ask some questions from that. Thank you.
I guess I'll start. So thank you so much for those really helpful comments and questions. And to your first question about the sources from Jose Garay himself, I think that's actually a really important part that I do need to find more sources on, because interestingly, Garay himself sort of traveled around the country and around the world trying to, personally sort of pitch this contract that he had, this grant, to whoever he could get to sign on to it. So he was like involved throughout a lot of the early life of the grant. But I don't have any like specific correspondence or sources from him yet, but I will search for it for sure. In terms of the party competition and how this maps on to the sort of changing party system within the antebellum United States, I'm not exactly sure, and that's probably something I should look into a bit more as well. My sort of understanding is that the particularities of both Louisiana and New Orleans' position within the South, and specifically related to this issue of engagement with Latin America, doesn't easily map on to some of the more national political rivalries. But I should probably clarify for my own thinking to what extent that's actually true. In terms of the Benito Juarez story, that's actually something that I had to cut down from this talk, but it's a really big part of the story actually, because when Juarez was exiled in New Orleans, along with several other Mexican revolutionaries who were colloquially referred to as the New Orleans Junta at the time, Juarez befriended this guy, Emile Lasserre, who was a newspaper publisher and wound up being sort of the president of the Tehuantepec Company in its later incarnations. He's the signatory on that stock that I had at the beginning of the presentation. And that personal relationship between Juarez and Lasserre was one of the main reasons the Louisiana investors continued to believe in the project. They thought, we have our man now. Like once Juarez ascended to the presidency in the late 1850s during the War of Reform, they thought, okay, perfect, we can go back in and revive the project. Now a guy who is personally friends with us is in charge. Lasserre and J.P. Benjamin and all these illustrious Louisiana figures take a steamboat down to Mexico City. They hang out with Juarez, who embraced them as old friends from Louisiana. But because of all these other things that intercede, like the Mexican or the French invasion of Mexico and the US Civil War, it kind of stalls. But then again in the 1860s, when Juarez comes back to power, that's what revives the project and again sort of brings new life because of that personal connection. So it's definitely an important part of my story. And then finally, to the question about filibusters and like, is the Tehuantepec Company basically just another extension of the filibustering energy? It's definitely something I'm parsing out, and because my dissertation is going to have a lot about filibustering and stuff, it's something I kind of need to grapple with. But my take on it is that this is somewhat, it's not disconnected, certainly, but it is an alternative approach, right? It's saying, instead of sending a private army to try to conquer a foreign territory and then demand recognition or annexation, let's see if we can get in through a legal channel expropriate all this land, build a meaningful infrastructure project that becomes central to world trade, and then that will sort of accomplish the our imperial aims, if you want to call it that, or at least our direct economic interests will be satisfied by this route, rather than sending an army, rather than sending guys like William Walker or Narciso Lopez to kind of stake a flag and see what happens. So I think of this as sort of an alternative approach, but given the context of all these other filibustering expeditions, certainly could have been perceived, particularly in Mexico, as an adjunct of those sort of threats that were very credible because they were actually happening on the ground.
Excellent, thank you. Our other two presenters?
Yeah, so I have a couple of things. You talked about the religious and legal aspects of the Great Chain of Being. You're absolutely right. The Chain of Being is really going to begin with Linnaeus and move forward. Everything that the South was doing was a cultural manifestation of scientific and religious aspects of the Chain of Being. The broader religious Chain of Being really hadn't been there in a while. It really stops at the water's edge of the medieval period. And almost all of the Chain of Being narrative goes to science as they start categorizing everything and everyone and kind of putting them into categories. And then opportunists politically, especially racist politicians, end up kind of adopting and bastardizing that for their own ends, see social Darwinism and everything else. And that was, for animals, often in aid of speciesism. And you mentioned that. Speciesism is a term that I know that we don't see a lot of in these kinds of settings. It is a term that was created in 1970 by Richard Ryder at Oxford, and it argues that the prejudice against animals is just as destructive and arbitrary as the ones for race and class and everything else. I mean, the idea that we would use species as a marker of difference and slaughter is insane, just as insane as racism is, which brings me to the foodways question. While I do talk in this larger project some about foodways, specifically in relation to how we use imagery to justify and hide what we're really doing to animals when we eat, I think the history of foodways is really problematic, and I don't like it, and I argue against it. The idea that we can culturally justify the killing of other beings because we say it's a cultural manifestation is crazy. We certainly wouldn't argue that the culture of overseers justified their behavior in slavery. And it is, foodways history is an act of speciesism in itself, preferencing artificially constructed culture over life. And so those of us who kind of work in the anti-speciesist realm of academia think that that is really problematic and a form of academic bigotry. So we don't really focus a lot on that. And finally, I'll say that you're right about class, in that white farmers don't like these laws. Rich people, of course, are the ones in Congress. They're the ones making these laws. They're trying to protect the large plantation owners. Smallholders are not going to like them because they see that, because they still have the same racial prejudices, but they see them as constituent of those fencing laws that they see as get the government's hands off my property, everything else. When you create these laws, you're essentially policing my ability to farm properly. And so while the laws aren't classist in intent, sorry, I have dogs going crazy everywhere. While the laws aren't classist in intent, they are certainly received as such by a large portion of white Louisiana, which is what forces some of those changes to happen. Let me mute this so that you don't have.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you for your comments and your questions, Michael, because I do in my larger work. So this is a reframing of an old manuscript that I'm trying to revive and reframe. And so this is just a part of it. So in the larger work, I do look at, you asked about Storyville. I do look at Storyville and they do participate there, right? So this is where it gets funny, because those are women, a lot of those women are Creole by ancestry, right? But as it becomes more of a cultural, socioeconomic identifier, those women kind of fall to the margins of the Creole community, and some of them fall out entirely. So St. Mark's Church did what they called an ethnic heritage project, where they did lots of oral narratives. And I don't even know if those records still, I collected this a long time ago. And when I went back to the Amistad to review them again, they weren't available because they were in really bad condition. But on these, when I listened to these a long time ago, and the transcripts that I have, the women are saying, well, my grandmother was Creole, but I don't consider myself Creole, right? And some of that is to do with this kind of shifting of categories. And so I can say that women of Creole ancestry do appear in the red light district, and not even in their own neighborhoods, they're getting in trouble for sex work and things like that. But to what extent they would be considered part of the Creole community, in places where they come to church, right? Church is one of these places where the classes come together. And you see some of these women who are poorer, possibly socially marginalized, they'll show up to baptize their children. And they may have Creole marraines and parrains with, who are more accepted in the community as a way of kind of uplifting them. So they do appear, and it just got beyond the scope of the paper, and I had to cut it before I sent it to you, but they are included, and that's a good question. I also wanted to address one of the questions in the chat, I believe it was from Cindy, about the omission. I'm trying to find your question, but yeah, you asked about what evidence is there that Creole women refused to give an occupation versus their occupation was purposely omitted by the census taker. That's a really good question. And actually, when I started this work, that's what I thought was happening, is that the census taker was omitting their wage earning labor. But as I continue to do the research, and Black women are primarily workers for the state. I mean, there's not much incentive to not record their occupations. But when I'm checking it against the city directories and other documents, I'm seeing, no, you do have wage earning labor, you are earning money. And then when I compare this to Black women's labor, if I assume that census takers are pretty equally doing their part to omit some of that work, I'm still seeing evidence of them skewing it purposefully and intentionally. And so that's sort of the evidence. And I think I only gave one example because I just had to cut it for time, but places where I'm seeing inconsistencies between the census and the city directories. And it's happening so frequently that I can't say what percentage are refusing and which percentages are being omitted, but I know that both are happening.
Thank you so much. So we did address, I think in Tom's comments, he addressed one of the questions as well that was already in there. Likewise, Dr. Mcpherson, you just addressed Cindy's question. We did have a question from Mary Lynn Wernette, and this is for Kyle Jackson. So she asked, what is your take on the Cavoti investigation as part of the demise of the railway and ship canal project?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I had to Google that and to see what the connection was, because as I understand it, this is related to the attempted impeachment of James Buchanan. So it's news to me that Tehuantepec was related to this, but as I go through the documents there, it looks like the connection would mainly be that the issue of public subsidization of mail service, so basically the government paying for the establishment of steamship routes to get mail service, like to and from the West Coast, for instance, that was always a politically charged issue, just because the issues of federal appropriations have always been a charged political issue, and certainly, especially so given the sectional crisis. So I'm going to need to do more research in terms of what it is that was revealed by this investigation. I know that the conclusion of the investigation said that it wasn't, there was no hint of impropriety, but as I understand it, it's falls into the broader category of Southerners arguing that they weren't getting a good enough deal from the federal government in terms of paying for internal improvements that would benefit the South, while at the same time, of course, being resistant to federal overreach and striving for regional independence and autonomy. So it's that kind of weird contradiction at the heart of a lot of these hot button issues of the era.
All right, excellent. Well, I think we have gone to our time frame. Again, I want to offer sincere thanks to all three of our panelists for excellent presentations, excellent PowerPoints, and I thought this was a very great, very informative, well done panel here on the politics of acquisition. Would like to thank all of the leaders of the Louisiana Historical Association, Dr. Wilson and others for putting on this excellent virtual event. And as Dr. Wilson mentioned at the very beginning, if you're not a member of the Louisiana Historical Association, please consider doing so. Thank you, you all, and look forward to seeing you live in person soon. Thank you.